today's discussion, we'll have to discuss deontological ethics. But before that, we'll have to discuss who is the person behind this deontological ethics. We have Immanuel Kant as our philosopher for today. Immanuel Kant was a German philosopher and one of the central thinkers of the Enlightenment period or during the modern period in the history of philosophy. At the age of 16, Immanuel Kant enrolled in his local university, intending to study math and physics. Unfortunately, Kant's father died unexpectedly while he was still a student, and because of the peculiar inheritance laws in the 18th century in Germany, Immanuel Kant did not inherit anything from his deceased father. Since he had no money to support for his studies, Kant left school and worked as a tutor for several years. Eventually, he managed to complete his studies and became an educator, giving multitude of lectures in logic, metaphysics, ethics, mathematics, physics, and physical geography. After over a decade as a lecturer, he became the chair of logic and metaphysics at the University of Königsberg. Kant was born in a German state of Prussia in 1724 and died in 1884 in Königsberg, just 2 months short of his 80th birthday. Deontology is often associated with Immanuel Kant. So what do we mean by deontology? Deontology derived from the Greek word deont, meaning necessary or needed, and logi or logos is a suffix in English language denoting a subject of interest or a study. Thus, deontology would be the study of the nature of duty. In judging actions, we usually consider an action to be right or wrong based on the consequences of such action. If the consequences of such action are good, then we say our actions were right or moral. If the consequences are bad, then we say our actions were wrong. By the way, do not confine the term moral and immoral within religious context alone when discussing ethical theories. Morality and ethics is used in two distinct but broad meanings. First, morality can be a code of conduct put forth by a society or group, such as religion, and accepted by an individual to regulate personal behavior. Moreover, morality can also refer to as the code of conduct with specified conditions set and followed by all rational people. So, in deontological ethics, weighing the cost or benefit of a situation is not a morality requirement. Actions and their outcomes are two independent things. This means that in deontology, there are things that you are obligated to do, and so you are bound to do it. This is called duty. There is no need to weigh the consequences for actions that are based on obligations. For example, you are duty-bound to make sure your family is alive and safe. Therefore, if your family's life is threatened, you are obligated to eliminate the threat. So you must do it. You eliminate the threat. But then again, what if by eliminating the threat, you also ended the life of this threat, and thus jeopardize the safety of those who depended on what you considered a threat? Is your action still moral, considering the domino effect of your actions? Well, according to deontology, your action is moral because you acted based on your obligation or duty to keep your family alive and safe. For deontologists, it is immoral if you do not fulfill your duty. If by fulfilling your duty, you ended the life or you killed or whatever or whoever is threatening your family, it was just a consequence of your obligation. So it has no basis on whether your act was moral or immoral. Was your action right or wrong? If your basis of right and wrong is the death in exchange for the lives of your family, deontology does not deal with that. That argument falls in consequentialism, not deontological ethics. Deontology maintains that it is your duty to ensure the life of your family. Then, your moral judgment should be to act solely based on your duty. However, your action must be without any shade of condition, except in fulfilling your duty alone. Ascribing a condition to your duty is not deontological ethics anymore. It would under an ethical system that is concerned with the outcome, and that is known as the consequentialism or consequence of our action. Why do deontologists not consider the consequence of an action as a requirement for morality? Deontologists give 3 points as to why the consequence of an act should not be the basis in considering whether it is moral or immoral. First, deontologists believe that the result of our behavior is beyond our control. For example, if the person who bought the clothes did not know the company's labor practices, it would be unfair to call a person immoral for buying such clothes and thus contributing profit to the clothing company that are treating their workers unfairly. Secondly, weighing the consequence of an action is impractical. If you keep thinking about what moral action to take based on the outcome, then you will have to consider all outcomes before coming up with a potential course of action. If so, when will you ever reach the decision? Will you be able to take action in time of need? Third, deontologists argue that basing the morality of your action through its consequence is doomed for failure because consequentialism will demand sacrifices on some group of people as long as it will provide great benefits to a larger group of people. For example, the consequentialist could argue that it is moral to keep slaves because slaves help drive the economy of a country. And a robust economy means the government has money to provide better services for the greater number of people. For example, his country's citizens. So in this scenario, the sacrifices of the slaves are good because there is also a greater good resulting from their sacrifice. When it comes to deontological ethics, making a moral judgment can arguably be easy to do because deciding on what to do becomes simple since you only need to base your action on your obligation or duty. You do not have to think about the consequences of your actions. However, it also begs the question, how are you to determine your duty and who is the ultimate authority in determining one's duties? Taking actions without thinking of its consequence also means disregarding the entire perspective or what you call the bigger picture of a situation or the issue. Deontology is mostly associated with Kantian ethics. Kant's deontological theory is based on his idea that the highest good is that which is good in itself and has no attached condition, meaning good without qualification. And that is, the intrinsic goodness will not make a situation ethically worse. He concluded that there is only one thing that is truly, indisputably good, and that, according to Kant, is the goodwill. The only good without qualification. Why? Because there are other goods that it only becomes good because of its result. For example, money. It can only be good as long as it has a value. If such currency is not accepted anymore or it is being demonetized, then it is not good anymore because you cannot use it to buy things. If you study just because you want to get a high grade or score in the exam, what if you did not get a high score? Or Your exam was cancelled. What good is there in studying? This is what we call the hypothetical imperative, the if and then situations. But for Kant, this is more on prudence rather than morality. So what is goodwill in Kantian ethics? Kant described goodwill as actions made out of respect for the moral law. And then he speaks of moral law. Kant is essentially referring to the sense of obligation. Have you experienced being instinctively pulled to a certain action even if you want to do the opposite of that action? For example, you really want to play ML or the Mobile Legends, but you feel something in your stomach that you associate with guilt because you need to study. Not because you must pass the subject, but because deep inside you know that as a student, you must study. It is your duty to study. And because of that feeling, you went ahead and studied instead of going for mythic. We usually think of this certain feeling inside us as our conscience, but for Kant, this sense is deeper than conscience because it is a sense that streamed from within the structure of human consciousness, which according to Kant is the structure of human reason and will. Kant argued that a person has the capacity to think or reason and that morality is the unavoidable obligation of or something that demands attention and action from reason. Kant did not believe that moral law came from external sources like God or God's commandments, government laws, or social norms and custom. Instead, he believed that moral law is actually the rational will, a will that is entirely devoted to and guided by the impartiality and universality of reason. Therefore, to obey the moral law is nothing else than to obey reason and will. According to Kant, people act out of respect for moral law, where he defined respect as a concept of worth or importance that completely and unequivocally overpowers love of self. Kant also claimed that the nature of reason is universal and that to ultimately know if your action is aligned with the moral law, you simply need to check if your action can be applied universally without condition. This concept of unconditional universal application is termed as the Universalizability Principle. The principle of this universalizability is the foundational principle of deontological ethics. It is a form of moral assessment wherein you evaluate if a proposed action can be performed by everyone else in exactly the same sense. Can my action be prescribed to all without contradiction? And with that, Kant came up with what he called categorical imperative. So what is this categorical imperative? First, we need to understand what do we mean by imperative. In the context of categorical imperative, imperative here is a noun that means a rule or a command. Central to Kant's ethical theory is the concept of categorical imperative, which he introduced in 1785 through his book, The Groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals. In a very simple sense, categorical imperative can be understood as a method for evaluating your motivations for action. It is an unconditional moral obligation which is binding in all circumstances and is not dependent on the person's inclination or purpose. Kant expressed his idea of categorical imperative as, to quote, act only according to that maxim whereby you can, at the same time, will that it should become a universal law. What did he mean by this? Kant believed that a person's action must be based on an unconditional act that must be followed at all times. and that this act must be desirable in and of itself, meaning it is an intrinsic value or an end in itself and not a means to an end. Like, for example, studying that we mentioned a while ago. If you studied because you wanted to pass the subject, then based on Kantian ethics, you cannot claim your action was moral because your motivation for studying was a means to an end. However, if you studied whether there will be an exam or not, and even though you wanted to increase your rank in your Mobile Legends, you still studied simply because students study. No ifs, no buts, and no conditions. And if students all over the world can study based on the same sense of duty, then your studying, according to Kantian ethics, is moral because your motivation was intrinsic and it was an end in itself. There are three significant formulations of Kant's categorical imperative. The first formulation is the universal law of nature, where Kant said to act only according to that maxim by which you can also will that it would become a universal law. The second is the humanity principle, which according to Kant, act in such a way that you always treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, never simply as a means, but always at the same time as an end. The third formula is the autonomy formula, that according to Kant, that every rational being must so act as if it were though his maxim, always a legislating member in a universal kingdom of ends. There is a fourth formula that gained favor among Kantian philosophers, but for this lecture, I will only discuss the first two formulas. Actually, you may have noticed that the universal law of nature was explained already, which is to act only according to that maxim, by which you can also will that it would become a universal law. So now, let me discuss the second formulation, that according to Kant, act in such a way that you always treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, never simply as a means, but always at the same time as an end. This formulation is called humanity principle. What was Kant talking about this second formulation? Kant derived his second formulation from the principle of his first. The humanity formula, he argued that as rational beings, a person cannot unequivocally consent to become a means to an end. As a rational beings, all persons must be treated as an ends in themselves, and that each of our reasoned motives must be equally respected. The unconditional requirement of deontological ethics still applies, because Kant reasoned that as a thinking rational beings, it is our duty to respect all persons in the same level. In other words, I respect you in the same way I respect myself. And I respect myself in the same way that I respect you. No conditions. Moreover, the same principle of universalizability also applies. For an act to be considered moral in terms of human relations, such act is bound to this formula. With Kant's first and second formulation, he also presented the concept of perfect duty and imperfect duty. Remember that Kantian ethics is deontological ethics. Thus, your action must be based on your duty or obligation. Hence, our perfect duty is to respect every person the same way, nothing more, nothing less. Remember also that Kant's concept of respect is not something you give, like the common saying we have, that respect is earned, or give respect to get respect. For Kant, respect is a total and unconditional concept of worth or importance that completely and unequivocally overpowers love of self. In Kantian ethics, a person is not a means to an end, Therefore, your actions to yourself and to others must stem from respect, and this action should be applied equally to everyone. This is Kant's concept of perfect duty. We also have the imperfect duty in the second formulation. Imperfect duty entails that while we should not treat the person as a means to an end, we also have a duty to further the ends of ourselves and of others, as long as our actions does not contradict our perfect duty. What does this mean? As you may know, the dynamics of human relationships is never black and white, nor does it exist in a vacuum. In its most basic biological explanation, human actions are geared towards survival. When you include elements like economics, psychology, and sociology, the dynamics of human relations become more complicated. Thus, a person cannot honestly and unequivocally say that he or she acts out of respect towards others truly unconditionally. Kant definitely understood these complicated dynamics of human relationships. His concept of imperfect duty is thus anchored on the argument that as much as we are duty-bound to avoid using others and using ourselves as a means to an end, it is also our duty to achieve our goals. However, inasmuch as we are duty-bound to achieve our goals, we also equally duty-bound to get others to achieve their goals as well. Thus, an imperfect duty entails taking actions towards achieving the goal, but at the same time taking action that others will achieve their goals, and to ensure that the actions hold equal importance. Take, for example, when you ride a taxi, the taxi driver is a means to achieve a personal goal, that is to reach the place you want to go to. In the same way, the taxi driver also used you as a means to his or her goal because your fare is his or her income. And both of you, the taxi driver, gave equal importance to your action. The taxi driver ensured you reach your destination and you paid the required fare. This is what imperfect duty is all about. Both parties were a means to an end, but each party acted towards achieving both a personal goal and the goal of the other. However, there is one very important provision that an imperfect duty must follow. Kant argued that acting on imperfect duty must never contradict on the perfect duty. So based on what you know about deontology and Kantian ethics, do you find this ethical theory personally relevant in your effort towards acting morally? Okay, to highlight some important topics. Number one, in this discussion, we talk about Immanuel Kant, a German philosopher who is the proponent of Kantian ethics, which is a form of deontological ethics, asserting that an action is moral only if the motive of the act is based on duty towards moral law. Secondly, moral law, according to Kant, essentially refers to our sense of obligation stemming from within the structure of human reason and will. Kant did not believe that moral law came from external sources, but rather it is the rational will entirely devoted to and guided by the impartiality and universality of reason. Third, categorical imperative is a method of evaluating motivations for action wherein an action is moral only if it follows unconditional duty, which is binding in all circumstances and is not dependent on any inclination or purpose, and that such action subscribes to the principle of universalizability, or the concept that an action can be applied to as well as used by all people. Fourth, Kant prescribed some significant formulations for his categorical imperative. The first formulation is, act only according to that maxim, by which you can also will that it would become a universal law. This is called the formula of the universal law of nature. The second formulation is to act in such a way that you always treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, never simply as a mere means, but always at the same time as an end. The second formulation argues that people are rational beings. Thus, all persons must be treated as ends in themselves and not as a means to an end. And that each of the reasoned motives must be equally respected. This is called the humanity principle. The last one, the first and the second formulation lead to the concept of perfect duty and imperfect duty. Perfect duty entails acts must be based on duty or obligation, which in a sense, this duty is about respect. Thus, our perfect duty is to respect every person, meaning ourselves and others, in the same way at all times without condition. It is our perfect duty to never use any person, including our own self, as a means to an end. We also have an imperfect duty, which is to further the ends of ourselves and others. This means that if your action is to fulfill a goal, then your action must equally fulfill other people's goal, for as long as these actions do not contradict our perfect duty. Okay, thank you, and don't forget to subscribe our channel for more lectures.